every 20 years, a filmmaker goes up to Kip Thorne and says, I have a problem. My central character needs to get from A to B. What do you recommend? And Kip Thorne says, well, look, I got the same answer that I said 20 years ago. Get yourself a wormhole.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus Magazine, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, we're speaking with Dan Falk. Dan is a science journalist and author. You may know him from his previous book, The Science of Shakespeare. He's also written for a wide range of outlets like New Scientist, Scientific American, Slate, and others. Dan is joining us today to talk about his recent story in Nautilus titled A Surprising Side of Carl Sagan. In Contact, the great science advocate posed a religious question about the cosmos. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, Brian.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you get interested in writing about science?
Oh, gosh. Well, I've been a science nerd for as long as I can remember. Let's see, I got interested in astronomy. I was lucky in that I was able to convince my parents to buy me a telescope when I was a young teenager. I was getting astronomy books from not only the school library, but the public library downtown. I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So yeah, huge science nerd. And I always kind of enjoyed explaining things to people. And, I'd set up the telescope in the front yard and, the neighbors would drop by. I'd kind of tell them some things about the moons of Jupiter and that kind of thing. So, yeah. And then, that's the short version. But yeah, I went to journal. I got a degree in physics, but then I got another degree in journalism and started writing about science. So that's kind of how things evolved at the beginning.
All right. So for our viewers who may have not read the piece yet, you want to give them a brief summary of what the story was about? What do you want to communicate there?
Well, it was really triggered by the 25th anniversary of this iconic movie, Contact, based on the novel of the same name by Carl Sagan. And, that the book, but perhaps especially the movie, has always just kind of implanted itself in my head for a number of reasons. But one of them is it's pretty good. As it's not a great film, but it's certainly a good film that takes science and takes astronomy seriously. And the way astronomers are depicted, the way the sort of struggles and difficulties they face is depicted is pretty good and holds up pretty well. I actually had a screening just only about a week or two ago, and I thought the movie holds up pretty well. But if you think about it, this movie is 25 years old. It's about the same age as Men in Black or Independence Day, and it's a world apart from those. And I don't want to say anything too bad about those films. And Men in Black is a comedy, and Contact is not. But it's just I think it affected a lot of people, and especially, this is something I explore in the piece, but it made an impact on many young women who were budding scientists, and many of them did in fact become not only scientists but actually became radio astronomers, just like the central character Ellie Arroway as depicted in the film. So for a variety of reasons, I thought, this is a film that has some staying power and some significance. And so I thought it would be good to explore a bit of that on the occasion of the film's 25th anniversary.
So with that 25th anniversary coming up, was the idea for writing a story on it kind of playing in the back of your mind, and you were waiting for an opportunity to do that? Is that how you got interested in doing this story?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've now forgotten whether I pitched it to other outlets or not, but I'm glad that Nautilus took it. And anniversaries are a little bit of a tricky business because some of them are big and obvious, like the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. Nobody is going to ignore that anniversary, but others just kind of come and go, and it's hard to get editors to be all that excited about it if it's sort of a lesser event. So yeah, I was glad to have the chance to write about it, and I think, I did get, well, after the article was published, I tweeted about it, and from some of the replies I got on Twitter, it was clear that I'm not alone. Like a lot of people were kind of touched by this film or by the novel, but I think, like I say, I think especially the film attracted such a big audience and left its mark.
What are some of the big differences or things that you liked more or less from the book versus the movie?
Yeah, a great question, because there are a number of very significant differences. I think that the big one concerns the ending, and here I'll just have to issue like a spoiler alert. If people haven't read the book or haven't seen the movie, then I guess like maybe fast forward for the next 45 seconds or so. But the novel has a, well, let me just recap what the plot is about. There's this astronomer, Ellie Arroway. She's a radio astronomer. She's on a quest to find out whether or not we're alone in the universe, and this practice is known as SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And at the time, the book came out in the 80s, the movie came out in the late 90s, and it was somewhat at the fringes of science, and it was hard to get funding for it. It's perhaps moved just slightly closer to the mainstream in the intervening quarter century. At any rate, Ellie Arroway faces a number of trials and tribulations in her quest, but in the end, she does hear a signal from an alien civilization. They eventually send instructions for how to build a device. No one is quite sure exactly what the device is, but ultimately it turns out to be a kind of transportation vehicle, something that will take an occupant. It ends up being Ellie herself, through space and time, ultimately through a wormhole, to what appears to be a planet orbiting the star Vega, where she eventually does meet some aliens. That's the short version of it. But the novel doesn't end with this contact, right? This contact that Ellie makes, that of course gives the book and the movie its title. But it continues, and in the novel, Ellie also sort of becomes a mathematician and discovers a pattern in the digits of pi. Now, viewers will, I'm sure, know that pi is both an irrational number and a transcendental number, which basically means that the digits of pi are, for all practical purposes, random. There is no pattern in the digits of pi. If you look hard enough, you'll find all sorts of things. Your phone number is in there. If you check the first somewhere between million and 100 million digits, you're almost certain to find your phone number. But that's, of course, that's what you expect from a random number of a certain number of digits. So there's no pattern there as far as our real life mathematicians have to say about it. But in the novel, there is a pattern which reveals itself. And I think that the way Carl Sagan words it is something like, if you look at it in base 11 or 11 dimensions or something, whatever, there's some kind of hand wavy thing where you actually see a picture of a circle in the digits of pi. And I think that's why one of Sagan's biographers, and I read at least two sort of good biographies of Sagan, one by Key, if I'm pronouncing his name right, Davidson, and the other one by William Poundstone. And I think, I don't want to get the two mixed up, but I think it might be Davidson who says, this for a non-believer like Sagan, this was an incredibly religious book, because how else could you read it as, the universe that Steven Weinberg famously described as being pointless. It clearly has some meaning in it that was embedded by the creator, whoever that creator was. Of course, the novel is a bit ambiguous, whether it's God or some advanced aliens or who knows. If I'm remembering correctly, that final chapter in the novel was called the Creator's Signature, which is a clever chapter title, but basically indicating that the universe was designed. And, it's a bit ironic because, as I say, Carl Sagan was not a believer in any traditional sense at all. And had he lived long enough to be part of the intelligent design debate, he actually died just as that debate was kicking into high gear in the 1990s. He would not have been on board. He would not have been a proponent of intelligent design, just as he surely was never a proponent of creationism. So at any rate, that ending that Carl Sagan had in the novel was kind of startling, even to me as a young person reading that novel. Early, I had not read a whole lot of other science fiction novels at that time. And then the movie, as viewers will know if they've seen it, the movie just omits that. It's just not there. So in the movie, Ellie goes through the wormhole, makes contact with an alien who, in order to make the experience more palatable, takes on the appearance of her late father, and they have a little discussion, and then she's sent back through the wormhole to planet Earth, where she has some difficulty convincing her colleagues that this journey even happened. Um, okay, so why the omission? Well, I mean, part of it, as Sagan's biographers have explained in their books, is that the film's producers, and it's a big project with a lot of people on the team putting it all together, but they were concerned that the audience wouldn't really know what pi was, wouldn't really know that there was any significance to whether or not anything was encoded in the digits of pi. Basically, they thought it would sail over the heads of viewers, so they just left it out altogether. And now, is that good or bad? I don't know. I mean, if you thought that that was a pretty strange and weird ending for the novel, then maybe you'll like the movie better because the movie just omits that.
Mm. What do you think Sagan would make, if you were alive today, of arguments about the universe having a purpose through things like the fine-tuning idea that the cosmos was so perfectly or very minutely tuned to allow for life, apparently, and for humans to come about?
Well, it's interesting. Carl Sagan was a pretty prolific author, and it's possible that he did write something about that somewhere. And unfortunately, I don't know because it's been a while since I read through Pale Blue Dot and there's a couple more on my shelf over here. The last one, collection of essays, I think maybe published posthumously. And so I don't know if he actually wrote about the alleged fine tuning problem. What I can do is I doubt that he would interpret it as being any kind of proof of a higher power or some divine entity. Maybe he would be interested in discussions that are going on these days about the multiverse. And I can just briefly talk your viewers through this issue. You mentioned the so-called fine tuning. I like to call it alleged fine-tuning because it sort of depends who you believe. It is sometimes argued that if the constants of nature were tweaked just a little bit, if the strength of gravity was a little bit different, life couldn't have evolved. Well, of course, these are sort of controversial statements. First of all, it's not clear that that this in any way privileged human life. Maybe it privileged amoebas or something. And also, most of the universe isn't very hospitable. Even in our own solar system, the planet Earth is probably the only one where you'd get Homo sapiens existing comfortably, even if there might be tiny bacteria possibly in the undersea oceans of Enceladus or something like that. So, you might just as easily argue that the universe is out to kill us, not out to preserve us. But it is an argument that a number of prominent scientists have talked about. And one argument that's been put forward, it's kind of maybe gained a little bit of traction in the last 15 years or so, is this idea that we live in a multiverse. And in this way of looking at things, even if the constants of nature are fine-tuned in some way that seem to privilege, let's say, life or human life, you would say, well, okay, but it's not exactly a miracle because there's all these other universes out there. And in just the same way that if you're lucky enough to win the lottery, you could say it's a miracle and the gods have been smiling upon you. But then you remember that all those other lottery tickets exist, and the people who bought those lottery tickets do not think the gods are smiling on them. So, in other words, things just balance out, and it's all a big cosmic lottery. So it's a controversial. Everything about this is a little bit controversial. For those who are interested, I'm actually writing. This is just in the way of a little bit of a heads up. I have a piece coming out in Discover that will look at this in some detail, and that I guess will be out sometime this fall. But I cannot say precisely which issue of the magazine it will be in. But I think it's a big and interesting topic. It's not going away anytime soon. Even people as prominent as the late Steven Weinberg, who had a Nobel Prize, spoke in a positive way about this possibility that the multiverse might be a way of sort of logically explaining what seems like the fine tune, some aspects of the fine tuning of the cosmos. But to your question, I don't know exactly what Carl Sagan would say, unfortunately, only that I doubt that he would sort of go from the fine tuning to, oh, therefore there must be a God. I think he would be interested in other possible avenues.
What were your first thoughts on how to report the story?
Well, the story combines, in some sense, it's almost two stories in one, and that did make it a little bit of a challenge. So, so what are the two stories? One of them is why is this movie important? Why is the story important? What challenges did Carl Sagan face in writing it? He was not born a novelist. He was a scientist. He was a research scientist. He did important work in various branches of physics and also astrobiology and that sort of thing. And of course, became very well known as a science communicator, but as a nonfiction science communicator. People of a certain age will remember his television series Cosmos. Now that premiered in 1980 on PBS, attracted a very wide audience, and I'm of the age that I was a kid, but I thought, wow, this is very cool. I was kind of fascinated by the program, the miniseries. But novel writing was new to Sagan, although as it turns out, I think he had kind of a knack for it. I think the novel is actually pretty good, all things considered. So that's part of what I was tackling in this story. But the other side of it is this impact that the story has had, and as I mentioned earlier, it very in a very concrete way guided or shaped the careers of a number of scientists, especially women astronomers, and not just one or two, but according to Twitter, like kind of a lot. Now, in the end, I only quote from one in the story. I interviewed more than one, but as it often is the way the editing process works and getting things to a desirable length, it ended up just being the voice of Yvette Sendi's at Center for Astrophysics, Harvard Smithsonian. So she is a radio astronomer, and she's not looking for aliens, but she is studying the universe using the tools of radio astronomy. She's used data from the Very Large Array, which is the array of radio telescopes in New Mexico that Ellie Arroway uses in the story. So I was really delighted to speak to her. I mean, she was very eager to talk about it, because she's as excited about that movie as I am. She was a bit younger than myself when she saw it. I think she saw it not when it first came out in the theater, but a couple of years later on VHS. So it was kind of melding those two things together. Carl Sagan turning from being a scientist to being a creator of fiction, and then the impact that this story had and the way it really, as I say, in a concrete way, affected people's lives.
What else would you have liked to have included in the piece besides other sources that you mentioned that might have helped shape the piece that didn't end up making it?
Well, it's funny. As I was sitting down to write the story, I thought, I know everything that happens in this film because I've seen it more than once. I saw it in the theater, and then I've seen it, several more times on home video or whatever. I have the DVD just behind me there somewhere on the shelf, and I thought, okay, I don't need to rewatch it. And actually, I was in New Mexico as I was writing the story. In fact, I visited the VLA, but getting a whole side topic there. I visited the VLA because it's fun to visit, and it was a few days after the story came out, not for the purposes of researching the story. But I sort of wrote the story with the research materials I had in hand, which was, I photocopied the relevant parts of those Sagan biographies that I mentioned, and I conducted interviews, including one of Carl Sagan's children, Sasha Sagan. It was great to talk to her, and she's an author in her own right. She has a new book that's come out quite recently. Let's see, where was I going with this? So, but then after my article was, or actually the same day, literally the same day that it went up on Nautilus, I was able to arrange a screening. So just by a little bit of a backstory, I was in New Mexico taking part in the Complex Systems Summer School, hosted by the Santa Fe Institute, and it was a lot of fun. It lasted about a month. And on the occasion of this 25th anniversary of the film Contact, I thought it'd be fun to just arrange a screening of the movie, and we did. And I was able to use their big auditorium, so we were able to project this movie on the big screen. And about 15 or 20 of us were watching, sort of graduate students and early career scientists. And I mentioned this partly to reiterate the point I made earlier that I think the film holds up really well. But you asked me what might have I included in the story that didn't make it in. Well, as I was watching the film, I was reminded of just how dead on Sagan and the various. I mean, it's Carl Sagan and Druyan's story primarily, and then a number of screenwriters fiddled with it, and of course Robert Zemeckis and the various producers tweaked it some more. But basically, there's a scene where Ellie Arroway has to beg for funding. She's initially funded from, I think, the National Science Foundation, if I remember correctly, and then that funding dries up, and she's pursuing other funders. She eventually gets private funding from some particular foundation headed by a mysterious billionaire, sort of kind of in the style of Elon Musk. It's not Elon Musk, but sort of in that, someone in that style. But I thought, that hits very close to home for a lot of scientists. Funding is really very far from guaranteed, and it is not unheard of to have, real life astronomers really do spend a lot of time working on grants, grant proposals. And many scientists are not at all sure where their next year or next 5 years of funding are going to come from. So that, I think, that must have resonated in 1997 and still does today. And also, on top of that, there are quite a number of scenes where Ellie Arroway has to deal with a male colleague who's kind of a jerk, I think, and that's probably putting it a bit mildly. Now, I forget the characters, something like Drumlin. Yeah, Drumlin is the character's last name in the film. And he does all kinds of mean things. At a certain point, he tries to take credit for Ellie's work. And, he gets to meet with the president while she doesn't, and, stuff like that. So, and also he's the person who tells her that her research is useless near the beginning of the film, and that he's doing a favor by cutting off her funding. So, so all of that, and I know from Twitter and just from talking to people that women scientists and women astronomers to this day, what was described in the film is not that far-fetched, unfortunately, that many women scientists do struggle having these kinds of interactions with male colleagues. Those are some of the things that I probably would have mentioned if I had seen the film just before writing the article. But like I say, I screened the film just on the same day that the article was published. But having said that, I think I got most of the things that I wanted to put in there. I think did make it in.
How did you end up finding scientists to talk to who were influenced or inspired by the movie or the book?
Yeah, well, it wasn't that hard to do. And I should mention, I'm not the first person to write about the influence of this film. As we noted, this is the film's 25th anniversary. So 5 years ago was the 20th anniversary, and some other people wrote about that. Shannon Styrone, for example, wrote an article, and somebody at the Washington Post wrote an article at around that time. So so they quoted a number of people, and I thought, all right, well, at worst, I can find some of those folks. In the case of Yvette Sendies, I mean, I know her. She I think did some of her PhD work at the University of Toronto, and I'm based in Toronto. But actually, I knew her before that because she's a contributor to Astronomy magazine, and so am I. And I've been had a subscription to Astronomy magazine for as long as I can remember. So I knew she existed, and that she's an astronomer and also a science writer like I am. But not just that. I mean, she's a radio astronomer, so I thought there's a good chance that she would have something interesting to say about the story Contact, and sure enough, she was delighted to talk about it. So yeah, it wasn't so hard finding people who were influenced by the book or by the movie. Now, not everyone necessarily had time to chat with me or whatever, but it wasn't so hard to get those elements and to put it all together. As I say, maybe the biggest challenge was because it is kind of two stories in one. So maybe in some sense that was the biggest challenge, just making it flow with a beginning, middle, and end, given that I was trying to communicate sort of more than one thing in the story.
Another big science space movie that came out not too long ago was by Christopher Nolan, and that was based on a story written by a physicist like Carl Sagan, Kip Thorne. Have you ever seen that movie?
Are you referring to Interstellar?
Interstellar, yeah.
Yeah, I did see Interstellar. Yes, and yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think Interstellar and Contact have at least one thing in common, which is that Kip Thorne plays a role. Now, Kip Thorne, I guess, was the science advisor, or possibly one of many, but he was certainly a science advisor in Interstellar, and the stuff that happens when they encounter the black hole has been praised for its accuracy. They take the time dilation effect seriously, and so on. And I think it's certainly to the credit of the filmmakers that they had Kip Thorne on board, and of course he's won the Nobel Prize. I don't know if he had the Nobel Prize yet when they were making the film, because he only won it fairly recently. But I don't know. You can check the timeline on that. But so I think that's one good thing about the film Interstellar. Now, by the way, I think there's some pretty ridiculous things about the film, like the whole issue of the corn blight. And I'm no agronomist, but I think no matter how bad your corn blight is, there must be an easier solution than traveling across the galaxy and going through a wormhole or whatever. So that I'm not sure it's the most realistic film in that sense. And then there's the weird stuff where the daughter is talking to the father by magically moving books in a bookcase or something. So that didn't work for me. But the stuff about the black hole was really well executed. Oh yeah, I was also going to say I don't think that clouds made of ice would just kind of float in the air. But anyway, who am I to nitpick a fine movie like Interstellar? But so what's that got to do with Contact? Well, when Carl Sagan was writing the story, he needed a way to get Ellie Arroway from Earth to Vega, a distance of 23 light years or whatever it is, in a reasonable amount of time. And he wasn't sure how to do that. And after all, I mean, Carl Sagan is a physicist and an astronomer, but he's not exactly an expert necessarily on general relativity and whatnot. So he was wondering whether a black hole might do the trick. But he had a conversation with Kip Thorne, and it was Thorne who suggested, no, not a black hole, make it a wormhole. The possibility of a navigable wormhole, although there's absolutely no evidence that such things exist, but they're also not ruled out. Einstein's theory of gravity, that's general relativity, appears to allow for these exotic objects, or at least in the 1990s, or I guess maybe the 1980s when Sagan was working on the novel. This was an open question, kind of still is today, but who knows? So some folks are kind of skeptical. Depends who you ask. But Kip Thorne said, what you need in your story is a wormhole. That will get your character from the Earth to the Vega system. And so that's what Sagan did. So yeah, I don't know how much else or how little the two films have in common. I think by the standards of the time, they were both big budget films. I mean, Interstellar had an enormous budget. Contact, I think, had a big budget by the standards of the day. But I would say there's an interesting difference that might be worth mentioning, is that while Interstellar has just a wheelbarrow full of special effects, like it's basically all special effects from beginning to end, except when Matthew McConaughey is discussing how to grow corn with some other people. But Contact doesn't. Contact has some special effects near the end. I guess maybe a good comparison there would be 2001 Space Odyssey, going back, a couple of decades earlier, where, right, 2001 A Space Odyssey, for folks of that generation or folks who just enjoy watching it on DVD or Netflix or whatever, I mean, it's this very powerful story, but nothing really happens until the very end, when Dave has to unplug Hal and that sort of thing, and Hal tries to kill the crew. So in a similar fashion, in Contact, a lot of the so-called action isn't really action. It's just this kind of cerebral discussion in which Ellie Arroway and some scientists and the president, they don't really. Bill Clinton plays a minor role, but they didn't hire Bill Clinton to be in the movie. They just used footage that happened to exist of Bill Clinton commenting on, I think, the alleged Martian asteroid that was in the news at that time. And the way they edited it, it looked like he might have been talking about, an alien message. So that was clever on the part of the filmmakers. Um, so there's a lot of like talking heads. There's a lot of scenes where an anchor on CNN is talking about something. I mean, they, according to some of the critics, they rely on that too much, right? If, by the way, for your viewers, if you get bored, Google Hollywood Review Contact, and you'll find the original review from 1997. And oh my God, they trashed it. The reviewer, it's not credited, it's just credited to Hollywood Review staff. So I don't know who gets the credit for this, but they absolutely trashed Contact and said it moves at a snail's pace and it relies too much on CNN talking heads. And anyway, but I sort of disagree with that. I think it deserves credit for having this kind of cerebral approach to things where they do talk about big ideas, and they the first signal from the aliens is a sequence of prime numbers, and they go on from there to trying to figure out how to decipher this code. But in terms of action, there just isn't very much until finally at the very end. They build this device to go through the wormhole, and there's a terrorist attack. And then they have to build the device a second time, which they do. And finally, Ellie goes through the wormhole. But it's a long film. I think it's on the order of maybe just a bit under 3 hours, but it's in that ballpark. And a lot of the action is sort of crammed into Act 5, so to speak. So anyway, I'm going off on a bit of a spiel there, but I think it's a good film, but it's a good film in a different way from, say, Interstellar, which is kind of more action all the way through.
Kip Thorne took his own advice to Sagan and also placed a wormhole, I think, by Saturn for the main characters to get to the other galaxy where there might be a potential home for human life.
Well, that's interesting. In that case, the parallel is stronger than I thought. If really the filmmakers were, so maybe it's a thing. Maybe every 20 years, a filmmaker goes up to Kip Thorne and says, "I have a problem. My central character needs to get from A to B. What do you recommend?" And Kip Thorne says, "Well, look, I got the same answer that I said 20 years ago. Get yourself a wormhole. Find a convenient wormhole, and that will solve all your problems."
Exactly. Yeah, he was. I wonder if Carl Sagan planted that idea in his mind for his own story in the future that he wanted to tell about not just the wormhole, but also, of course, the black hole that shows up in the movie. I think it made me think about that scene when Matthew McConaughey falls into the black hole to make it more palatable for viewers, just like in Contact, they made the aliens take a human form or her father's form to make that more palatable. Inside the black hole, as you mentioned, he's kind of floating around through a bunch of different scenes of his memories with his daughter and sending messages through time because, I can't remember exactly what the reasoning was, but I wonder if they had discussions about whether that would be over viewers' heads and something played out where they kept it. But of course, as you mentioned in Contact, they removed that bit about pi because maybe that was too complicated. But yeah, it was difficult at first to understand how McConaughey was supposed to be communicating through time in a black hole to his daughter, and so that his daughter in the past could communicate with her father in the future. I mean,
I would have to rewatch it. I only saw Interstellar once in the cinema, so I guess that was already a number of years ago. But I would be cautious about hoping to get some logical science out of that scene. Like I think it does border on the ridiculous, and I'm not at all certain that Kip Thorne played any role whatsoever in those scenes that you just mentioned, where Matthew McConaughey and his daughter are trying to communicate, and that weird thing with the bookshelf. I mean, it's, in my humble opinion, it's all just a bit absurd. Even if the relativity stuff about passing near the black hole, even if they got that part right. Of course, you've reminded me of the other big thing that these two films have in common, namely Matthew McConaughey. Of course, he's older and wiser in Interstellar.
Right.
It would almost be funny if they tried to make him the same character, make him like the grown-up version of Palmer Joss, who he played in Contact. I guess that wouldn't really work because he's a farmer or so. I don't know what he is in Interstellar exactly. But yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. As I say, I only saw Interstellar the one time in the cinema, so I'd have to brush up. But it was a very interesting film, and as you say, it does have a couple of things in common with Contact.
Mhm. So, what are you working on at the moment? I know you mentioned you have a piece about the multiverse coming out, but is it sounded like you were done with that piece. So, what's on
Yeah,
your plate now?
I have submitted it. That is true. It was very quite fun to work on. Um, and let's see. I also have a piece. Well, one piece that I'm still working on about dark energy, and I can just remind your viewers what dark energy is all about. In the 1990s, astronomers found that distant galaxies are not just moving away from each other, which is what you would expect in an expanding universe, but they're also accelerating. Now, the cause of this acceleration is rather mysterious. So nobody knows what it is. Astronomers and physicists have given whatever it is the name dark energy, no, but that's really just a placeholder. So we don't know what dark energy is, but it appears to be working against gravity, pushing everything away from everything else. Einstein did suggest that such a thing might exist 100 years ago, kind of prescient of him. Anyway, at a certain point, he decided that no, actually, maybe this thing isn't needed. He called it the cosmological constant, but he put it in sort of as a fudge factor in his equations to make them work out. That was before Edwin Hubble and others discovered that the universe is in fact expanding. So I know I've kind of told that in a slightly convoluted way, but the gist of it is that maybe this thing that Einstein proposed, this so-called cosmological constant, maybe it's real. But as I say, nobody knows what it is. It seems to be well, what Einstein imagined it to be was just an energy associated with empty space. In every cubic meter of space, there's a certain amount of energy, according to this idea. And like I say, ever since the late 1990s, we've known that something is pushing the galaxies apart from each other. And, well, we don't know. It could be the cosmological constant or it could be something else. The article that I'm writing, this is for Smithsonian, um, involves a specific instrument called the Dark Energy Spectrographic Instrument, DESI. It's mounted on the 4-meter telescope at Kitt Peak in Arizona. And yeah, they're mapping the universe in 3 dimensions, but which is interesting in its own right, and it'll be a very detailed map of how galaxies are distributed in the universe. But also, it's a way of seeing how galaxies have behaved over time. So astronomers hope that by studying this, they'll gain some insights into exactly what dark energy is doing. Is what it's doing now related to what it was doing in the past, or has the strength of the dark energy changed over time? So again, there's a lot of question marks, a lot of unknowns about this, but it's hoped that a project like DESI will shed some light on it. So yeah, that, and as I mentioned, the multiverse story that's coming out. I guess they're probably both coming out this fall. One in Discover and one in Smithsonian. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that have been keeping me busy recently.
Could you use the fact of dark energy as a counterpoint to the fine tuning argument, given that isn't the end game of dark energy to kind of push everything apart and eventually make life not possible anymore in the universe? Or what is the ultimate consequence if the effects of dark energy don't change at all, if they just continue constant?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of framing it quite that way, but you raise a good point. I mean, if dark energy just pushes everything apart, then the long-term fate of the universe is pretty much sealed. Your viewers probably know at least a little bit about the so-called heat death of the universe. This is what will play out many billions upon billions of years in the future. Stars burn out, galaxies drift further apart from each other. Um, the entropy of the universe goes up, and eventually new stars can't form because there isn't enough gas and dust in one localized place for that to happen anymore. And the stars that exist burn out. Big stars collapse into black holes. If you believe Stephen Hawking, the black holes evaporate through a process called Hawking radiation over billions upon billions of years. There's also a question of as to whether protons decay, and maybe they do and maybe they don't. But regardless, what you're left with after a long, long time is just a flotilla of elementary particles, and no one seems very confident that you could have a life or intelligence in this scenario. So now I hadn't thought about framing it the way you just suggested, which is that if somebody says, "Oh, look, we live in a universe fine-tuned for life," you could say, oh, but do we? Because we live in a universe that's got our own demise baked into it, with this endless expansion and this endless push towards the inevitable heat death, which will make life impossible. So that's interesting. I mean, I don't know. Of course, if someone is really obsessed with the fine tuning thing or wants to frame it in a positive light, they'll say, "Oh yeah, but that's way down the road. Like right now, it's fine tuned for life, and that's what matters. Never mind that we're all going to die down the road." So I don't know. Yeah, I don't quite immediately know how to tie that the two things together, the fine tuning argument and the dark energy. But yes, I suppose you could sort of try to bring them together like that.
I mean, if you were alive in a civilization toward the end of the universe's lifetime, you would see the effects of the oncoming heat death, right? And you wouldn't conclude that, oh, this is fine tuned for life.
Yeah, I don't know that we're getting into science fiction territory there. That it's a great question. What would life be like in those final stages? I'm thinking of the Woody Allen quote, "Eternity is a long time, especially toward the end." So
Yeah.
what would things be like? The universe is young, right? The universe is 13.7 or 8 billion years old and is going to be kicking around for at least another 100 billion years. And then finally, these events that I described start to play out. And some of them take much longer than just that. Um, so there's a lot of time for stuff to happen. Now, what happens if so we've already sort of discovered or found evidence for the dark energy after 14 billion years, but we can still see other galaxies. The James Webb Space Telescope has recently started sending back images, and they're fabulous, of course. But many billions of years from now, all the stuff that's not gravitationally bound, which would include all those galaxies imaged by the James Webb, will be beyond our cosmic horizon. So we won't see them. We won't have any information about them. So I know this sounds a little bit like a joke, but what I always say is astronomers today should write down what they found, and definitely not just render those images digitally, but print them out and maybe get them laminated so that they stick around for a while, so that astronomers in the future will know that there used to be these things visible in the night sky, as eventually they'll live in a universe with basically nothing in the sky except for, I guess it would be the Andromeda Galaxy and the Magellanic Clouds and some stuff that, if I'm understanding the physics correctly, which I think I am, but stuff that's gravitationally bound to us would stick around, but the other stuff would just be pushed away, so far away that we would not be able to see it, thanks to dark energy, as you mentioned. So yeah, what will those astronomers think? I don't know. I mean, they will they think the universe is fine tuned? That's a tough one. I mean, yeah, maybe instead of maybe they'll just think the opposite. Maybe they'll think that the universe is out to get them, and why do we live in such why has the universe forsaken me, and that kind of thing. So who knows? I'm not the get into some sort of philosophy slash theology there, but it's interesting. Yeah, I mean the universe right now we live in a time when it's a good time to be a cosmologist because you can aim a telescope at the sky and actually see stuff, and that'll be true for the next however many billion years, but not forever. If the dark energy has the value that it appears to have and has the function that it appears to have.
Right. Yeah. I mean, far enough into the future, astronomers trying to look beyond their own galaxy would not be able to see any other galaxies because they would be flying away from us or them faster than the light would be coming to them. Correct? So it would be black, and they could reasonably conclude that they're at the center of the universe, or the only galaxy that exists, which used to be the idea back in the 20s, right?
Yes, that's right. Again, I hadn't quite thought of it in those terms, but but that's right. Astronomers in more than 100 years ago, you're quite right, didn't know that there was anything beyond our Milky Way. And of course, there was a debate as to what the Milky Way was, right? So the idea of a galaxy didn't come into its own until circa 1920 or sometime during the 1920s, and it was much debated up to that point. I mean, nobody really knew how big the universe was. Not that we have the final answer today, but we've learned a lot. So now we know that the Milky Way is one galaxy out of many billions, hundreds of billions, and that each of those contains however many stars, 100 billion stars or so. So there's a lot of quote worlds out there. yeah, we were just beginning to put that picture of the universe together 100 years ago. Now, what that view will be like in the future, and it's, I guess we've strayed a bit from the subject of Carl Sagan's story, but that's okay. But yeah, I think astronomers in the future will. I don't know what it would be like to be an astronomer. You'd be essentially a Milky Wayist, right? You'd be to be a cosmologist would be a Milky Wayist. You'd just study that and the Andromeda Galaxy and the Magellanic Clouds, and I forget whichever other little galaxies are sprinkled around here, and you'd draw whatever conclusions you could draw from them. And maybe like I say, if you had some nice textbooks written in 2022, then you would know what happened, because you would know that all those other galaxies used to be visible. If the records of all those photographs had been carefully preserved, then that would be fine. But let's say you're some other civilization, or a civilization on Earth that's exists in the future after we've you know become extinct or whatever. So some new civilization comes along and they don't have access to those records. Well, then I don't know what they would think. I guess they would think that the Milky Way is everything. And I have no idea what they would conclude from that. I mean, I guess they'd, when they started studying things like the Drake equation, I guess it would be called the Grok equation or whatever. Whoever figured out that equation in their universe, instead of thinking about life, with the probability of life in the Milky Way, and then multiplying that by all the other galaxies that exist in the visible universe, they could stop right after they did the Milky Way, because that would be it. They wouldn't be aware of the existence of those other galaxies, so they'd have some simplified mathematics. Yeah, I don't know. This is great. It's fun to think about. Yeah, it's I don't know. Like I say, we should write down and put in a very secure library, not the one at Alexandria, or one with much better fire alarms than the one at Alexandria, but a really good library, so that astronomers billions of years from now will know what we saw through our telescopes.
Yeah, it's a haunting thought that people could be simply epistemically closed to reality. It's just, in that case where all the other galaxies have just flown away from you, you cannot detect them. And so you would have to conclude that you're alone. But yeah, so want to tell our viewers where we can find you online, and where they can find more of your writing? Are you on Twitter? You have a website we can check out?
I'm happy to plug my Twitter account. Yes, I'm on Twitter as Dan Falk, so it's just my name, DanFalk. That's my Twitter handle, and whenever I have something published, or I also use it for photography. Not that I'm the world's best photographer, but I like to put my photos out there too. So people can find me on Twitter at Dan Falk, and then I'm also on Instagram at I think Dan Falk Science, if I recall correctly. I have a YouTube channel, I think also with that same name. I have a Facebook page, which I think is Dan Falk Writer, if I've got that right. But if you type in Dan Falk into the Facebook search engine, only one of them will be a page, so you could click on that. Yeah, so if I have anything, any articles coming out or whatever, that's always where I put them. Hope I haven't forgotten something, but yeah, I think those are the main ones. Twitter.
You've also
Facebook
been doing a podcast with Amanda Gefter, right? Is that still going?
Yeah, it is. Thank you. How embarrassing that I almost forgot that, but thank you for pointing that out. Yes, Amanda Gefter and myself have a podcast called Book Lab, as in laboratory for books. So we review popular science books. We have a lot of fun with it. We've done about 30-ish episodes so far. Now, the only catch is we don't get paid. If anyone has any tips on how to monetize it, but it may not be trivially easy, given our, we only have, I think, about 1,000-ish downloads per episode, so it may not be quite so easy to monetize yet until we hit the big time. But so we do it as a labor of love. And that means that we're not always right on track in terms of a schedule of putting new episodes out. And that's why it has been, I'm afraid, a number of months since our most recent episode. But yes, it is continuing. Amanda and I hope to get a new episode out soon. How soon is soon? I don't know. Soon, hopefully within a couple of weeks. So yeah, folks can look for that under Apple Podcasts, or we also put every single episode up on SoundCloud. So all you need is an internet connection. You don't even have to subscribe to anything if you don't feel like it. Everything is there on SoundCloud. But yes, it's called Book Lab, and it's a fun podcast. as I say, where we review the latest popular science books.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dan. Appreciate you being on.
Well, thanks, Brian. It's been my pleasure to talk about all this. Thank you.
Until next time.